It's Wednesday, December 11th, 2024. This is Ashton Ellett here with another installment of the Two-Party Georgia Oral History Project, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. I'm in Santa Cruz, California, joined this afternoon by Dr. Melanie J. Springer. A native of Southern California, Dr. Springer is Associate Professor of Politics at the University of California, Santa Cruz. Prior to taking her current position, she was Assistant Professor of Political Science at Washington University, St. Louis. She earned her MA, MPhil, and PhD in Political Science from Columbia University. She is the author of How the States Shaped the Nation, American Electoral Institutions and Voter Turnout, 1920 to 2000, and co-editor, along with Steve Smith, of Reforming the Presidential Nomination Process. Dr. Springer has also penned a number of peer-reviewed articles on Southern politics, including Why Georgia, a Curious and Unappreciated Pioneer on the Road to Early Youth Voting Enfranchisement in the United States, which wins my award for the longest title on Georgia politics. Dr. Springer, Melanie, thank you so much for taking the time out of your sabbatical to do this interview. Let's start at the beginning. Tell me a little bit about growing up in Southern California. You grew up in Orange County.
That's right. Well, thank you for asking me to be here. I grew up in Fullerton, California. I lived in a sort of on a small street, a cul-de-sac. My parents were both have transplanted from the Midwest to live in California. A decade or so before I came onto the scene. I have an older sister, and my dad was devoted to politics. He was a banker by trade, but he read, multiple newspapers a day, and we always had a real vibrant conversation about politics. And somehow along the way, I became quite interested in understanding government and how we organize ourselves as groups of people. I went to all my years of education in Fullerton. I went to Fullerton High School, and when I graduated from high school, I went on to study political science and history at UC San Diego.
Okay.
I really wanted to go to Berkeley, but I didn't get in. And I was happy to go to San Diego. Yeah, well, thank you for that. I was about an hour and a half from my parents' house, and it was real familiar, right? It was like a beach town, which Fullerton isn't, but we used to take the bus to the beach really regularly. It was very close. But that actually ended up setting me on this path. I went to UC San Diego. I ended up studying political science, and as I said, I ended up double majoring in history. All my girlfriends went to study abroad, and instead I stayed in San Diego, and I picked up another major. I was not totally sure what I wanted to study at first, and I ended up taking a political science class with Matt McCubbins, who, unbeknownst to me as a sophomore, just starting out college career, is a foremost scholar of political parties. And I took his first class. I was a freshman or sophomore. I must have been a sophomore because it was like an upper division kind of elective-y class. And everybody else was a graduating senior. And he said to the class, it was like a positive legal theory class. Raise your hand if you're going to go to law school. And all of us raised our hands. And then he said, I'm going to make it my job to talk you out of it by the end of the quarter. And I thought, that's curious. And then I didn't understand anything. Everybody else was, much more familiar, much more sort of older, going to law school, all of the things. And so I would do my homework, do my reading in the library, and I would email him every week, asking him questions about the reading, just thinking, I am making a fool of myself. I don't understand any of this. And then at the end of the quarter, he wrote me and called me into his office and asked me to meet with him, to which I was terrified and thought I'd really embarrassed myself. And when I got there, he said that I'd really been on the right track, and he offered me a job to be his research assistant as an undergrad.
Wow.
It transformed my entire life. So I worked for him as a research assistant for my junior and senior year of college, and I did an honors thesis with him, and he was just a model for like,
Yeah.
oh wow, this is how you do research, and gosh, I want your job. And I was really around. I mean, I just did photocopying mostly, but I was around all of his grad students, and it was really. He had me. I didn't go to law school.
which is unusual as an undergrad, because what you're describing is almost what most graduate students would describe their relationship with their major professor or their advisor. But you're saying, from that very early on, you're like, I want to be like that guy.
Yeah.
So what sort of research projects were you working on? What was your honors thesis? Was that one of those things where you had it figured out by the time you were 21 years old?
No, well, so I took two, I guess I took as many classes as I could with him along the way, along with obviously other professors. It ended up being, such a fantastic poli-sci department, and very much, thought, I'll go to grad school because I know if I stop and do anything else in between, I probably won't go back, and I want this career and I need to get this degree. And so he had finished writing Legislative Leviathan with Gary Cox, and so he was on to other projects. I guess deliberative democracy was getting worked on about that time. It was like a big infusion of cognitive science into political science in that time too. And so what I did, having taken a class with him on parties and Congress, was basically I was kind of trying to apply a mini version to the California state legislature.
Okay.
So as you asked, like I could see already in that time, like the early seeds of me being really interested in state politics, and that, it is this very professionalized government, and how many of these theories can we apply from the Congress, the U.S. Congress, to the California State Assembly. So that was my politics senior thesis. Meanwhile, I was also writing one in history.
You did too?
Yeah. So in history, I was really interested in American history, and especially I had this really interesting professor who was teaching at the time. She was a new professor in history there, Stephanie Smallwood, and she was studying the slave trade, mostly from the sort of UK British early slave trade examples.
Okay, yeah.
Where I was very interested, especially in the U.S. case. And so I wrote a thesis on the beginnings of different ways of thinking about like U.S. slave rebellions.
Yeah.
And so I was already, and probably looking back, maybe I'm less proud of that work because I don't think it was as rigorous as like a historical study would be, but I really enjoyed it, and I loved taking that style of seminar classes and such with her. When you were in the honors thesis programs in both departments, you had these small sort of honors classes and stuff your senior year, and so they were mostly the most like a grad seminar, unbeknownst to me, having not done that I would end up in. So I felt much more at ease when I did apply to grad school, and I went straight from undergrad, which now looking back, none of our students really are going, a few of them, but aren't going straight from. And I just, so anyway, I applied to like a whole bunch of schools, and I...
Did you apply for political science and history?
Just
or
political
did you...
science, yeah. I was sure that that's the type of work I wanted to do, but I also, obviously had a heavy emphasis on my historical interest in my applications, not knowing the verbiage of, American political development, and which was just sort of becoming a new thing, really, because I graduated from college in the year 2000. I applied to Columbia University, and I got accepted, and I had no idea, again, what luck I would have, because on the one hand, I thought, I'm going to get there, and I'm basically going to continue working on parties and partisanship, and, the extensions of my own thesis, my work with Matt. And then, so one of my advisors out of the gate, was very interested. I was Greg Morrow and Nolan McCarty, who went on to Princeton, but was there, and they were, really encouraging of me, and having come from San Diego and having worked with Matt. But also one of my sort of strong supporters at Columbia from the earliest stage, the person who called me to say that I got accepted to the program, was Ira Katz-Nelson, who, as everyone knows now, but I didn't know at the time, and was this big, granddaddy of American political development. And so, my love of history was really embraced from the very beginning of what could have well been, a very quantitative pursuit.
So you came in and you did a master's and an MPhil. What's the difference between those two degrees?
It's just sort of if we were in my office, I would show you there are two separate degrees, but it seems to me that that some universities do that and some don't. And it does seem to be, and I've never looked into it, but it seems to be a bit of a throwback, like the MPhil.
Yeah.
Because the master's, because at Columbia there is a master's standalone program.
Right.
So I was admitted to the PhD program. So after a certain time, you get your master's, and then after you finish your comprehensive exams, that's when you're awarded your MPhil, which basically means ABD.
I see. So you didn't do a master's thesis project. That was just awarded on the path towards.
Yeah, there was probably a certain number of units you needed to have completed, and then but we had, what was really cool about it was that we had all the students that were in the master's programs also in our, seminars with us. So it was they were much bigger classes.
Okay.
I mean, on the average of 15 students rather than 5 or something, but it made it real interesting. But I'm pretty certain that the standalone master's students do a thesis.
Okay. So you get to Columbia, you get to know your advisor, Ira Katz-Nelson, and you went in thinking you were going to do one thing. Tell me the process, the conversations, the thought process that got you from political parties to what you ended up writing your dissertation on.
Well, again, I guess I have a tale of very important people, and I guess you never know when you're going to meet that person.
Yeah.
But I, very much thought that I was going to do this one thing, and then I took a graduate seminar on elections and voting behavior with Bob Erickson, and I was so excited by this class, and I fell into a natural groove with Bob, and I read, whatever the coursework 1 week on voter turnout was, and I just thought, this is the most incredible puzzle I've ever seen, and I'm gonna have to be the 5 millionth person to write their dissertation on voter turnout, because I think this really could be addressed in a very in a rich historical way that I'm not seeing. And so with that, I wouldn't say I abandoned parties, because I'm still very interested in them, and I dabbled in teaching a class about it a few years back. But also at that time, it was just I want to understand, I love understanding institutions, and so political institutions, that is. And so I was just so intrigued by how the political institutions that structure voting have such an immediate impact on turnout and on who gets to vote and who doesn't, which is separate from, just sort of the political behavioral questions of that. It's more like the parameters of the actions.
Right.
And so I came up with an idea to study voting laws in the American states, and I was really inspired by Alexander Keesar's book, The Right to Vote. I still assign it every year in my classes, and I've yet to meet Mr. Keesar, but I really was just transformed by that work. And so it ends prior to 1920, and I just sort of thought not that I could do that caliber work, but if I could start in 1920 when women have the vote and move it forward, that's what I want to do. So I pitched it to Bob Erickson and to Ira, and they co-chaired my dissertation, which is, if you know them, they're wonderful people. Their work isn't naturally put together in this way, with Bob being this premier behavioralist, Ira being this incredible political historian, and yet they both agreed to work with me, and so that's how it came to be.
So what was the research process like? Because quick math, there are 50 states, at least there were 48 for the first 39 years, 39 years of the study. How did you go about collecting all those data points and research to write that. Because I'm this guy who does such local and state level things. It's like, oh my God, 50. How do you do that?
Thanks for asking. Yeah, it's interesting because it was at a time, and again, it's long ago and not that long ago, but right, it was like 2002. I finished my PhD in 2006. So
Okay.
like rigorous state politics, comparative state politics assessments and examinations in political science, especially in quantitative things, were just really taking off as like, wow, we can systematically use this variety, this variation you just described as leverage in being able to test theories and have more examples, more data, more over time analyses. And so a lot of my data is, in the aggregate, right? So it's like, state level, meaning not individual level behavior. Right. So we have a lot of information about voter turnout at the individual level. So like things like race and education level, income level, these individual level determinants that we can get through surveys that we know impact turnout. Like that's going back to the American voter and the Michigan school and like the early days, right? So you still have to pay attention to that, even if I'm saying, I care about the institutions. So a voting law exists in a state at the state level. So I needed state level data on all of my sort of variables of interest. So many of those things I could get from the statistical abstracts, which come from the census, which is not, there are imperfect aspects to all of these, and census only happen every 10 years. You have to do some statistical interpolation between, but my real sort of bread and butter of that study, and which goes on to become that first book, single authored book that I wrote, are the voting laws. And so trying to get them from the state level from 1920 to 2000 was really like the bookend. Meant that I spent actual years of my life in the Columbia Library basement looking at microfiche because it just so happened, and I didn't know that all campuses, big campuses, don't have this, but they don't. But this law school was one of the ones that had all the state codes on microfiche, and so I would take my computer into the bowels of the Columbia Law Library, which is actually underground for anyone who's ever been there, and sit there and look at microfiche for days and code data. And it wasn't pretty, but I knew that at the end of it, I would have something that didn't exist. And
So you're doing all of that. You're compiling these things, and as it comes together, the South and its voting laws, especially post 1900, pre 1965, post 1965, they're unique at the as opposed to other regions. And what were you noticing as you were doing that research? As obviously you're a political scientist. You've read VOK, or at least you knew.
Yes.
VOK's massive tome and Alexander Hurd and that entire school. What were you beginning to see, and is that what sparked your interest in Southern politics?
Wow, funny that you should mention Mr. Key. I definitely adore VOK, and Ira really helped, instill that. I think we both really had to have a special place for him in our hearts. And he, I actually read Southern Politics one of my first summers in grad school when I got called for jury duty in New York City. So that's just what I brought along because it was going to be a long read.
No cell phone.
It's true. So I don't know, really. Like, I have always been interested in the South. I mean, I think that even the subject matter of my honors thesis in history, but even going back, I don't know, just a few years back, my mom was going through some things in a house I grew up in, and she discovered this old like essay that I'd written in junior high, 7th or 8th grade, that won an award, but it was all about Harriet Tubman. And I won like a big award from it. And so I feel like this thread of like what happened in the South and these myriad of experiences has always been with me. I also knew that I was interested in a not just South versus the rest of the country story about voter turnout and voting laws. And so what stuck out as I was starting to gather that data regarding the voting laws in particular was, first off, just reading the state constitutions over time and how they change, right? And so as a student of state politics, you become aware about how comparatively easy it is to amend a state constitution, how much minutia live in the state constitutions in contrast to the federal constitution, and just sort of the blatant and explicit racism found in so many of these constitutions in the South and also in the not South. And so thinking about, wow, okay, we think about Jim Crow, we think about poll taxes and literacy tests, and also they existed in Nevada, in California, and they're directed at other races and other groups. And so I was really captivated by that. I mean, you don't often think of like a young 20-year-old woman living in New York City just spending her nights reading state constitutions. Right. But that I was, and it was really quite fascinating. So while I was compiling the data that I thought was obviously what I was going to need from my work, I was also keeping lots of side notes. And so I guess that was one thing that certainly stood out about just the particulars of how these state laws actually exist, in fact, across the nation, and how they vary and how they don't vary, and how they stay stagnant for a long time, and then how they change, because there's lots of the qualifications which tend to be the most discriminatory are in the constitutions, but then of course there's just pieces of legislation pertaining to these other aspects, and more we would think of expansive reforms and those sorts of shifts. And so so I'd say I went into it thinking definitely the South, and also that I knew that the audience for this book and my own interest would say like, oh, it's like we know that story. We know the story about voting rights in the South to some extent, and that's not the story I was trying to regurgitate. But in fact, the punchline of that work really is that it's we should be very wary of laws that seem to try to suppress voting or limit it, because they're successful more often than not. And then on the flip side, efforts to expand the vote or expand voter turnout are usually either not successful or minimally successful.
Right, because one of the things, and this is obviously a more recent, not phenomenon, argument, is in a lot of places, especially the South, you have an expansion of no excuse absentee voting, early advance in-person voting, vote by mail out west, is here in California. That's why it takes so long to figure out who won the House of Representatives. But what you're saying is just because it's easier to vote doesn't necessarily mean more people actually turn out to vote. Is that what you found? Yeah, I mean, it's tricky, right? Because it's not, I think the expectation, be it or not, accurate or not, is that, reformers, and I go back to even thinking about like motor voter, when you could just register to vote at the DMV, which seems like just such a minute shift, right? Is just making registration one step easier, insofar as you find yourself at the DMV with any irregularity, right? But the punchline of that law in particular, which was hotly debated for many presidencies, in fact, was very partisan, and then it seems to make this like very little accomplishment. But I think that the expectation really was that if we bring this reform, make it national. Yeah. Right, and everybody now has to have motor voter or election day registration. Then turnout will be just as high everywhere as it is in the places that always had it. And I think that was my story of saying, there isn't this like one size fits all metric for voting laws, right? You can't just expect
in a state that's always had high participation, that you can just port one of their laws that seems expansive and stick it in Georgia, and then turnout's going to, increase because you have all these other layers and history and cultures and other operations working against that.
Right, because when we're talking about the South, and we go back to the VOK era that he's looking at, really, post-populist era up to, what was that, 1949? And the lowest voter turnout is in the South for obvious reasons, but not just the disfranchisement of African Americans, but the effect of disfranchisement of poor whites, and also the fact that why would you actually turn out? You don't need to.
Competition.
And you're right. This is a one-party system. Yeah, there's bifactionalism every once in a while, and that can juice things. But what is it? What are the ingredients for high turnout states versus states that just don't turn out high numbers?
When?
Yeah, when?
That's the other thing. Because
over those different periods of time.
Well, it's interesting because that's I don't mean it flippantly. It becomes a question in my book, but also if I'm teaching my students, I have. We see these national turnout levels of being whatever they are, and you can say they're high or they're low. It's all relative to what you think is high or low. But then if I say but if my story is about how states, thanks to federalism, control electoral laws, then the state variation is actually interesting. So then let's look at those averages over, differentiated or disaggregated, by region. Okay, well then you see the South is below the average, but the West is always high and the Midwest is in between, so then you're seeing variation over time. And then you can even say, well, what makes up a region? Well, the states do. Okay, so let's see what if we do it by state, right? And then now our figure is completely, cluttered and way too busy to actually read. But the point is that, there's all this variation over time. And so if we think about states, particularly in the Midwest, that have high turnout tendencies, then we have to think of a story about why and when it matters, right? Because is it about competition, electoral competition? Is it about just a greater sense of social capital and involvement? Is it about, a higher educated populace? Is it about, mobilization strategies that are actually effective? And also just a culture of prioritizing participation. And so all of those things can be operating in different levels in every event.
So you did the bulk of this research in the early to mid 2000s for your dissertation. Revision over the next few years, published in 2014, which is 2 years before the sort of Trump era. If you were to, and it's 10 years plus on from the publication, what has happened in state voting or voting behavior, voting laws that if you were to, magically have the time to revise a second edition of that book, what would you add? What would you change?
I've thought about writing, a second version. I think. Well, a couple of things. There's lots of people working on these questions now, for sure. Much more so than I remember happening when I was working on it in 2006. That the prioritizing questions of vote suppression and voting laws in particular. And there's a greater array of these types of voting laws. Again, just as I was finishing my dissertation and going on the job market in 2006, that was when we saw the first seeds of the strict voter ID laws. Literally 2 months before I had my first job interview, which just, on the one hand, as a person that cares very much about participation, was heartbreaking, because it felt like, but the whole point of my book is that things like this are really effective in suppressing voters. And so there was that, but then there was this other bit of me that was like, wow, this just made this is the so what, right? The so what is that, yes, we know about literacy tests, we know about the poll tax, we know about those things, but Melanie, aren't those things of the past? And at that exact time, the poll tax was being called the modern day, the voter ID laws was being called the modern day poll tax. And so it just felt like, wow, it's coming back again. And this like sort of the way that I view and teach politics is this sort of forward movement and backward slipsliding that we always have, you know, in my heart, I hope still this march towards this successful experiment of democracy, but is also, you know, prone to these types of resurgences.
Right.
So I would say that, you know, one of the reasons I don't want to write the sequel, besides the fact that I feel like there's lots of great people working on these projects right now anyway, is that it's kind of heartbreaking, in fact, because more would be documented of the restrictiveness than the expansiveness. And that was actually how I was ending the book, was kind of as a warning, so to speak. And I was told by my, you know, very well-intended editors, like, Melanie, this is kind of, it's kind of coming off like a bummer. You know, this is my words, not theirs, but that was the sense of it, was like, maybe you want to leave something more hopeful. And I am, you know, a very hopeful person and instructor. And I just, I don't know. I mean, I'm working on a new project that I think will be the rest of my career, focusing on lots of facets of political rights for Native American peoples.
Oh, wow.
And in particular, the paper I've been writing most recently on my sabbatical pertains to the long history and contemporary examples of Native American vote suppression. And once again, you know, it's it needs to be discussed and to be better learned about. You know, taking for granted that there are very powerful, forceful interests at play that don't value enfranchisement or that don't seek to make voting easier or more inclusive.
Well, how much of, you know, you're talking about these periods of sort of, when we're talking about election laws, stasis, and you know, these periods of a flurry of activity. How much, you mentioned voter ID, and that's I was going through college, you know, high school and college, and learning about these things when I was active in politics, and it seemed to be driven very much from Washington. You know, Karl Rove, the Bush White House were very interested in pursuing voter ID laws, and that was carried out through the RNC and folks like Hans von Spakovsky from Atlanta. And then you had, after 2020, a flurry of activity directed very much from Donald Trump on Twitter and Truth Social. And so how much of it, is that a new phenomenon of where you have individuals at very high levels, sort of this elite level signaling of what they want the laws to be? Or has that sort of always been the case when it comes to voting restrictions? That's
a real tricky question, because
my job here is
I love it. No, it's so I am a student of state politics, as I said, but I'm so intrigued by federalism.
Yeah.
Right, and so we have this incredible moment at our founding where, you know, to get the deal done, the states get to retain control over the electoral processes in their borders with very little federal oversight, right? Mm-hmm. With the asterisk, obviously, there's a few notable exceptions, but more often than not, the states call the shots, which is really why we see, you know, all this variation in the way election day leading up to election day. The last few elections have gotten a lot of press for being so different. And really, I had never considered that, having grown up in Orange County, voting one way, until I moved to New York City. And I got my new driver's license, I got registered to vote, and it was the first time that I had a different type of voting experience, having grown up in California and now voting for the first time in 2000 in New York City, meaning that, you know, there was many more state party interests listed on the ballot, which I had never seen before, where it's the same candidates, they're just endorsed or supported by, you know, you're voting for candidate X, care of the Labor Party or care of the Democratic
the
Party
Working
or the
Families
Working
Party.
Families Party. It was just like, what is all of this? And then nothing was automated at that point. So it was still these really cool like flip boxes
the
and
levers
stuff.
and-
Yeah. And so like just logistically, and then, in real practical terms, it was much different. And so I think that really sparked part of the story about me being in that election seminar and being like, wow, like it really is different. And if you don't ever live anywhere else, you wouldn't necessarily know that. Obviously you could learn that, but actually experiencing it yourself, right, is a different beast. And so I think that, maybe there can be loud national figures, getting back to your question, instructing state actors that they need to be doing X, Y, and Z, or stroking the fears about fraud, which is how almost all of the voting restrictions are rationalized. I mean, in my classes when I'm teaching about, literacy tests or poll taxes or things that seem and were explicitly racist, I also give the counterpoint to like, how are they delivered as acceptable, right? How are they deemed necessary? And almost always, especially now with respect to voting IDs, the concern is fraud, right? And lots of my colleagues, very esteemed, have documented time and time again that the claims of fraud are usually unsubstantiated. But all you have to do is make people fearful that could be the case, and or make up or show one example of that having been true. And so I don't know how to exactly answer the question because now we certainly have loud people at the top yelling about these issues and state actors responding. However, for a long time in American history and probably yet again, the states also really push back on the federal government actors getting involved in state election laws.
Right.
Because it is their one like really important piece of the turf where the states get to decide, they've gotten to decide for all of American history, and they don't want the federal government taking away that right. And so that's why the motor voter legacy was so contentious for so long, and that you could almost describe it in a laughable way now, that like, what were these big battles about? Bill Clinton was going to fall on his sword over it. And it was just like, but it's just to say that people can say, yes, they want to get registered at the DMV and at government agencies, which included welfare agencies, which is really the kicker of the objections. But the point being is like, but the point, at the time, they didn't want the federal government mandating something for all the states. So, sub in any other nationalizing law that could be, a poll closing time or a particular ballot or, on and on and on, that the states don't want to give up that territory, even if they start to parrot some of the claims being shouted. Yeah.
Well, and I guess, this is coinciding, again, with the publication of the book. You have the very steady erosion and carve-outs of the Voting Rights Act of 65, the Shelby case, and subsequent Roberts Court decisions that are affecting these things. But when I think about these national voices, you have the federalist system that you're talking about, and on top of that you have an incredibly nationalized politics that wasn't the case for most of your study in the way that states voted for different parties at different levels, and now increasingly your state senators are the same party of the presidential candidate that you're electing governors to, and how that nationalized politics sort of trickles down or infects the federal system. Again, not a hopeful story necessarily, but I suppose it could run. The stream can turn the other way, I suppose, as it did in the 1960s, but we'll see.
It just becomes an interesting angle for like the notion of states' rights, right? And how that's become shorthand for things that it was ever meant to become shorthand for.
Right.
I wanted to say one thing though, that I was
Yeah.
remembering back to my days in the law school library in the basement. That getting back to Georgia in particular is that as I was reading those constitutions with a keen eye for like, oh, I'm interested about these voting qualifications, I would read the various iterations of the constitutions. And so they would get, amended and changed and whatnot. And this is where I found the voting age changed in the great state of Georgia. And I checked the date and I was like, how is this happening in the 40s? This doesn't make any sense. And I mean, it's just nestled in there with all the other limitations. And so that was one of the notes that I made, and I filed it away and just and it's even in my dissertation, in my book, as a footnote of like, because when you're calculating voter turnout, traditionally you're taking the total number of votes for whatever race you care about over the voting age population or the voting eligible population, thanks to Mike McDonald's careful calculations. But he does it, at the time it didn't go back as far as I was anywho. So voting age population got I could get through the census. And so anyway, so to do it accurately, you had to subtract out and make adjustments for the states that allowed for the lower voting age prior to the 26th Amendment. And there was Georgia again. And so I filed that away as to always wonder someday why Georgia. And it was only once I had my first job and my book manuscript was well underway that I could turn to that question. And anyway, I had a great time doing it. I've met a whole bunch of people that study like the 26th Amendment and just switching the lowering the voting age nationally and all of these aspects. But I often will still get asked, why, if when I'm presenting the work, sort of like, why would Georgia do that or something. So anyway.
What was it that captivated you so much? I'm looking at your CV here, and it's a 51-page article, 51 pages, single space article on.
There's tables in it.
Well, of
and lots of footnotes. But go ahead. It's a long work. Yes.
Yeah. So, and I have to assume a lot of that was comparing and contrasting the 1877. Constitution to the 44 Constitution that was all part and parcel of those Arnold era reforms, right along with regulating the railroads and ending convict lease labor and those sort of things. But what was it about you? You weren't a Southernist. You sort of gravitated to this because they decided 18-year-olds could vote.
Well, I'm a wannabe Southernist.
Oh, well, yeah.
I have such reverence for Southern politics, and I love studying it. And I have another paper that was born of me living in Missouri in my years at WashU in St. Louis, because people kept saying like it was the South or it wasn't the South. So I kept asking like, well, where am I? I mean, it's not very dissimilar actually living in Santa Cruz, because people are very, is it Northern California? Is it not Northern California? Where are we on the Bay? And it's a thing. And so it's like I have a long history of not knowing exactly where I live, I guess. But in Missouri, because there was such obvious signs in St. Louis in particular, in the central West End where I lived, of racial discrimination, like gates that used to be there, and all sorts of things, that it made me so curious, because to someone that grew up in Southern California, it looked like the South to me. Everything I kind of would shorthand as the South, and doing some understanding some history of St. Louis and those sorts of things. I became engaged with this question yet again of like, well, what is the South, and how do we think about a state boundary as also connoting something, meaning, right? Yeah. And so when I was, again, figuring out how I was going to study voter turnout, and then reading the Constitution of Georgia, and then reading about literacy tests and poll taxes and the white primary, which I spent a lot of time learning about and teaching about, which are just so explicitly discriminatory, then do you also lower the voting age, I think 12 years or so before Kentucky does, and so it just felt so like such an outlier of like, oh, I want to understand that story sometime. Yeah. And even though I didn't have time, And I remember in a meeting with Ira saying, oh, I just found this really interesting thing when I was working, and gosh, why would Georgia do that? And he looked at me and he said, well, why would Georgia not? And I was like, okay. So, all right, I'll figure that one out then. And so it took me a long time later, but yes, and the work is quite long, and it probably in retrospect could have, should have, maybe would have been a book, but I'm quite proud of that paper, and also as an example of my earliest attempt to do historical work in a real serious way.
Yeah, it felt much more like, not to flat, but a lot like an Ira Katznelson work, where you are, this is clearly a historical piece that is informed by political science methods and practices. Well,
I'll take that as the highest compliment I have ever been given that I can think of, actually. Thank you very much, Ashton.
Well, again, that's not my job, but it's true. But you've also collaborated, which is something that political scientists do a lot better than historians, is collaborate. You've collaborated with my friend Seth McKee. Tell me how who is very much a Southernist through and through. How did you guys get plugged in, and what sort of work have you been doing, or did you do together in the past?
Yeah, well, Seth is fantastic, and he and I became acquainted when I was going to state politics conferences in particular, and he read a paper of mine. I can't remember now, it's been so long ago what it was, but he reached out to me just sort of saying that he liked the paper and my writing style, and would we want to collaborate. And I thought that sounded like a great idea, and like I said, I love the South, all things the South, even if it doesn't make perfect sense how I got there, but we had a good time. I was still at WashU at the time, and I would hope that we could get back in touch to do some more work together. Actually, after I know he suggested that we speak, and after that, I reached out to him to say, thank you for the invitation and introduction, and that he and then I told him what I was working on in regards to Native American participation, and he said, well, now that he's in Oklahoma, and he understands it much more directly, and that so maybe we'll get back in touch again too.
This is sort of a more meta level question. Why is it that political scientists collaborate, whereas humanists and historians like us don't collaborate?
I'm not the best person to ask. I'm much more of a solo authored gal than most, I think. I have to say that the times that I've collaborated with people, I mean, it's fun, period. It really works well, especially with quantitative work in particular. So when I was in grad school, I also was a political quantitative methods, political methodologist sort of minor as an American politics scholar. And so I did a lot of that, and I'm still, do that as part of my own research strategies. But I'm now in a department here at Santa Cruz where all the American politics scholars are all APD scholars, and even all my other colleagues really are historical institutionalists. So here we're very much eclectic in terms of like what types of research we do and what's the best sort of toolkit to use. I think that when you do quantitative work, it's much easier to sort of division of labor is much more obvious. Dividing it up,
the prose person.
or not even that, but just like, who's got time to run this or get this data or get that data, or who has a great RA that can help, and I don't know. That's what it seems to me in the times I've done it. I don't know if I'm more of a, I guess I'm a little bit more of a hermit when it comes to my work. I don't know. I think of myself as a writer, and so when I am working, I kind of get into sort of a zone that I don't tend to divide up very well. I've
Sure.
never been very good at delegation,
Uh,
which is not a good thing.
Same.
However, the times that I have collaborated with people, it's always been fun and really gratifying, and it's definitely efficient, much more efficient than a 51-page paper by yourself.
Hey.
But I had some great RAs to help me with that too. Yeah, so I don't know exactly why, but if you get a good answer from someone, let me know.
I've just always been fascinated by, it just seems, division of labor goes a long way, especially in the era of diminishing returns in academia. Collaboration is important. But you mentioned that your current project and what you think of as sort of the trajectory of your career going forward is Native American voting and voting laws impacting Native Americans. I assume that was also born out of the dissertation research, that you're seeing all of this and that you sort of put that over here and it's like, I'm going to work on that later, or did you rediscover that sort of interest, or how did that come about?
Well, interestingly enough, it came about by my sort of a reappreciation for this topic, this incredible overlooked and mistreated group in the United States in particular, and that living, I think, here and in particularly on this land, and just having this greater awareness to how mistreated these nations have been for so long, and how it's been absent from my work, how it's been absent from much of political science, feels despicable, to be honest. And so I started to learn more about it in Santa Cruz, make some connections on campus here, and slowly but surely just thought where I thought that my next project would be about partisanship and political change. In fact, I was so put off thinking about working on that I thought, hey, I want to do something that feels really kind of worthwhile, like it needs to be done, and it's not being done to a great degree. It's not to say that I'm the only person or anything to that extent, but so I just took an interest, and I started reading about some news articles during pandemic, during the 2020 election, about some particular mobilization efforts happening in the Navajo Nation, and the amazing gains and turnout that happened. And that even these very small communities can shift the balance of elections in state and local races in particular, and sometimes to the national level. And that even as I started to work on it this last spring, beginning of my sabbatical, and now, they haven't even been counted in the census since prior to 1990. So even trying to go back to do similar work that I've done on this group is impossible by conventional means. It just means we have to get
into the archives.
I know, I'm going to view archives and just to get more creative, and about how we approach it. And I'm certainly new to this group, and I've been trying to make connections in it. I've been really appreciative of all the support that I've been given so far, and the enthusiasm for the ideas. One of the questions that I had, I have kind of two parallel tracks of research going on at the same time. One is about vote suppression, because I felt like I needed to, with 2 quarters of sabbatical, 10 weeks each, like my spring quarter was spent trying to do both, and then for the fall I thought, hey, I gotta focus on one to maybe have something done. But the other paper is something that came out of teaching I teach a senior seminar in state politics, and there's just this maybe 1.5 page treatment in the textbook I use. It's like this great Virginia Gray et al. State politics textbook that talks about how native sovereignty, and in my mind reading it, it's like about geography. And so the question is something, and it's not very eloquent at this point, but if state boundaries are man-made, as we describe, as I said, with like what's the South, where's the South, is it based on geography or is it based on something else? Similarly, we have we have got states that are sovereign vis-a-vis the national government. And then we know, like, when we travel from California to Nevada, something's changed, right? And so laws change, regulations change, but it's a fictitious line. So what if also within those states are these sovereign places and they're Native Indian reservations that have their own set of laws and powers and governments? And then how do we think about, like, the layers of sovereignty vis-a-vis federalism within this whole system?
Yeah, and you think about those in Oklahoma, for example. These are tribes who are from the east who are moved west, and these are not ancestral lands. But if you go out to Arizona, especially southern Arizona, these reservations are on a shrunken version, but historically, that those were the nation's land, and how that may contribute to these different factors you're talking about. Of course, Arizona is a very good place to look at because of close elections recently.
This is the point. Yeah, this is
Ruben Gallego actually visited every tribe, every recognized Arizona tribe as part of his campaign. So,
yeah, and just to really make it full circle, I think that this research, as it, I started off with these two in my mind distinct papers, but like my vote suppression paper is already looking like it could be a book, or it's like it's every part of it has legs that are like rabbit holes, which are really exciting to pursue. But also I was thinking about trying to connect my interest in the South with this conversation about Native peoples, and think about like how Native individuals in the South have been mistreated over time, and that we know so much about many other groups and so little from a political science perspective in particular about these. And so how might we do better about that? So
the Seminole tribe in Florida, but also I think very more recently recognized tribe, the Lumbee in North Carolina, where you have the Lumbee tribe recognized by President Trump in a very swingy district in South Central North Carolina. Something to think of, and of course you have obviously the Eastern Band of the Cherokee, who are still in Western North Carolina.
Exactly.
So.
And I went back to the Right to Vote by Kesar, and there's not a ton in it about Native disenfranchisement, but it's also in there in a way that in the first 17 times I ever read the book, I didn't quite internalize it as much. So, so I feel like it's all connected, which is why I could say, and I have a long career ahead of me, not to say it's like the end of my career, but by any stretch. But the point being is like, I see that this is where I'm headed, and I think it's really exciting, and I think the South is part of the story.
Fantastic. Well, Melanie, thank you so much. I know you've got to pick up the kiddos from school.
Thank you.
I got to get on the road too. So, but thank you so much for taking the time. It's been really, really fun to get to know you and to get to learn more about your sort of contributions to Southern politics, history and politics. So thank you again on behalf of everybody at the Richard B. Russell Library.
Thank you.